Thank you very much. It is both a pleasure and an honor to be here with you today. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Franco-Korean Chamber of Commerce and Industry for organizing this new webinar on COVID-19. It's a new one in a series, as has been recalled. All these webinars have been very instructive and interesting. And I also, of course, would like to thank you for inviting me to say a few things from the standpoint of the French Embassy. Basically, I'll be brief because you have gathered an impressive host of speakers who will address the various aspects of today's very important topic. Let me start precisely with this, and it's a kind of a paradox. Talking about healthcare in the middle of what is probably the worst pandemics of this new century would seem like the obvious thing to do, and yet we didn't do it more early. And why is that? Probably because in the beginning, the existence and the severity of the crisis were not perceived with the same accuracy everywhere and by everyone. Probably also because the economic sector was also, like others, impacted by the crisis, and so was the healthcare sector. It was impacted by the social, economic consequences, especially in Europe. And probably also because some of the initial debates on treatments were loaded with political charge. And actually there is an ongoing debate on this today. So in short, we have a global health issue that has been very political from the onset and will probably continue to be so in the near future. However, the healthcare sector is absolutely crucial to allow us to consider the notion of the day after, because it's only with the adequate vaccine and treatments that we will be able to consider this day after. South Korea, after having been recognized worldwide as one of the leading nations in terms of crisis management for these pandemics, has taken the measure of the importance of research on vaccines and treatments. And as a token of this, the fact that President Moon Jae-in visited the Institut Pasteur Korea recently is a clear demonstration of that. The work on Institut Pasteur Korea on repositioning of existing molecules is very promising. And this institute will be at the center of Koreans' future research efforts in this area. For Korea, there is clearly an edge, and we already can hear about K-care, like we heard before about K-pop or K-food. This is very promising. It would be naive to consider that there is no competition for finding a vaccine or a treatment. Globalization did not stop. It does not mean, however, that these undertakings should be led by nations alone or by companies alone, actually. France's cooperation on research in the field of healthcare is very old. And I have been mentioning the Institut Pasteur Korea before. Institut Pasteur Korea is actually a member of a network of Institut Pasteur scattered all around the world. And some of them have teamed up to try to identify possible treatments for the virus. But this will be discussed at a later stage. France also is eager to cooperate on business development. Over the last few years, actually the Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs has launched the French Healthcare Association back in 2017. It's a brand, and it's also an organization created as an animation tool of the healthcare providers, and also some kind of marketing tool of the French expertise in this field. So in Korea, in South Korea, for instance, there is a club for healthcare gathering most major companies, most French major companies active in Korea, like Sanofi, Biomérieux, Guerbet, Ipsen, Servier. And their goal is to promote scientific, academic, and business exchanges between the two countries. So we have a solid base for strengthening cooperation in this field. I would like to say a few words also, even though the situation now is not very favorable, about academic exchange and student exchanges, because we have several very promising fields of exchange in the field of science and nature science in particular. And several exchange programs have been unfortunately suspended because of the crisis. So I hope that soon the possibility for students to come again in Korea will be resumed, and that this exchange will start again. So what is very important also in this endeavor is the idea that these vaccines and treatments will be benefiting the biggest numbers. And there has been a debate about this, and our president was one of the most prominent figures in the world to talk about vaccines as public goods. And this is something that not only questions the international organizations, but also the way the sector itself is organized and is willing to take on board these challenges. So I think we will have in this seminar, through the presence of research, people from the research field and also people from the business field, a very good interaction and a very good articulation on these two questions. So with these words, I would like to have a word of hope that we will soon find that the research work will bear fruit, and that we will be able to envision an exit strategy for this crisis. With this, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. DERUFFE. We'll continue now with Dr. Anh WARTEL, Associate Director General and Head of Clinical Development and Regulatory Affairs at the International Vaccine Institute.
So yeah, good morning, good afternoon. And first of all, I'd like to thank FKCCI for this webinar and for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here today. So I would like to touch upon the research international cooperation much more from the vaccine standpoint. So here is my presentation content. I just want to say a few words in terms of introductions. As we had pointed out lately, we are all facing this unprecedented pandemic of COVID-19. We now have more than 13.5 million confirmed cases and close to 600,000 deaths globally. We truly believe a strong and continued international and cooperation with global solidarity to respond to this COVID-19 pandemic. And remember, no one is safe until everyone is safe. It's a quote from WHO. And in IVI, I think we can really leverage the private-public partnerships model. And actually, it has already been used in COVID-19 pandemic response in Korea, for instance, when we talk about the COVID-19 contact tracing is one example. But the PP model can also be used for vaccine development, actually. I will come to that in a minute. So IVI is, as you may know, it's an international organization. Our mission is dedicated to enabling actually the world's most vulnerable people to have full and productive lives. And we are really into vaccines development, and we are aiming at accelerating vaccine R&D for global health. And we do that with multiple partners. We are not alone on that journey. And as I said, we are headquartered in Seoul. We had been established upon the United Nations Development Program Initiative in 1997. And then we now have 37 countries, signatory countries, including state donors. We now have 3+1 coming soon with Finland. We have state donors with Sweden. We have India. We have also, of course, Korea that has been supporting IVI since the very beginning. And we'll be having soon Finland as a state donor as well to IVI to accomplish our mission to develop vaccines. So in terms of model, I was mentioning the PPP model. We have quite extensive partnership worldwide. We have partners from different organizations, from different stakeholders. We have, of course, the very outstanding support from the current government to do our activities and complete our missions. We have other governments, other countries to support us. And we have also extensive collaboration with academia, with industry, and also we have a very strong support from philanthropic organizations such as Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or Wellcome Trust, to name a few. And then we lately had also a very strong support from CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemics Preparedness and Innovation, that has funded some of our projects, as you will see in a minute. So IVI has been looking into this COVID-19 response from multiple perspectives, if you will. We have funding or support from current stakeholders, for instance, to look into one of the components of the vaccine development is to look into the laboratory vaccine evaluation support, how to assess the immune response of the vaccines, for instance, once it is administered to the subjects. We also have a support from, as I said, from CEPI, international organization, to help us execute or to help us conduct a clinical trial in Korea. And we just started actually a vaccine trial in Korea with a phase 1/2. You will see that in a minute. What does it mean exactly? But we just started this trial in Korea with a vaccine candidate coming from a US-based company. We also had funding actually from Sweden, Germany, and also Finland to look into, I would say, developing countries, how to strengthen the disease surveillance there, because we know that it's underreported. They don't have the same testing capabilities as there are in Europe, for instance. So that's something we want to also support the developing countries to strengthen the surveillance system and to detect the COVID-19 cases. And we have also different initiatives that are much more related to multilateral engagement, with our contribution to this very first, what is called Group for Global Infectious Disease Response, that has been initiated upon Korea, actually, to have this group looking into global infectious disease response. So we have been involved since the very beginning in the COVID-19 response from multiple angles, as you can see here on this slide. So in terms of vaccines development, that I want to touch upon now, and the timeline, because we all have heard about this compressed design or compressed timeline, accelerated timelines, 12 to 18 months to develop a vaccine. So I just want to give you an update where we stand within a very short time frame, I would say within 6 months or so. When you look at the vaccine development landscape, it has grown dramatically, impressively. As of today, or actually as of yesterday, there are more than 200 vaccine candidates. And when you look into the ones that are now being tested in humans, there are close to 30 vaccines being tested in humans, and there are a lot of more vaccines in early stage of development. So it's really remarkable to see how the different developers or the different stakeholders have been engaged in this race for having a vaccine against COVID-19. It's good to see that. It's good to see that there are multiple vaccines being developed with different vaccine platforms, different candidates at different stages. Because it's unlikely actually that one company will meet the global need. We need more than one company to do so. So a strategic approach to multi-pronged endeavor is absolutely crucial to respond to COVID-19 pandemic. Now, when we talk about the vaccine development, as you may know, it's a quite lengthy and costly process. Under the usual circumstances or the normal circumstances, we usually say it takes 5 to 10 years to make a vaccine. And actually, it's a quite long period of time. But remember, when we develop a vaccine from discovery stage in laboratory all the way up to licensure and then commercialization of the vaccine, it can take a decade to have the vaccine available for public use. And when you look at the rate of failure, actually it's quite high. If you have 10 vaccine candidates at the early stage, you want to bring them to licensure, only one will make it. So I think we have to remain hopeful. But timelines are indeed compressed. We talk about 12 to 18 months if everything is going right. So now when you look at the history of vaccines development or viruses here on this slide, what I wanted to say here is that actually a lot of progress has been made already. When it comes to shortening the timeline between, let's say, the first major outbreak to the first trial in human, the phase 1, for instance. If I take one extreme example with dengue virus, it took 38 years from the very first major outbreak until you get into the first testing of the vaccine in human. On the other hand, when you talk about the recent years, and when we talk about MERS or SARS-CoV-1, the SARS virus, actually it took 22 months and 24 months between the first major outbreak and the first human study. It has been shortened already. And now with SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, it had taken actually a shorter time frame to get a vaccine into the first trial in human. It took 3 months. So it's really remarkable. And what has also helped for development of a vaccine, as far as I'm concerned on this topic, is that, of course, we all know there is a very high awareness now from the public, from the countries, from the government. Of course, everybody is aware of COVID-19 pandemic. Then there's a sense of urgency, a great sense of urgency to have a tool, to have a treatment to tackle this global public health concern. And then to do so, to accelerate somehow the development of the vaccine, there's also a great engagement from regulators, because we need to go through the whole vaccine development studies, but then we need to submit the dossier to regulators. And the regulators from multiple countries are very engaged to fast track the regulatory pathway, to accelerate the review with the complex design of the study without bypassing, of course, a safety scrutiny step. So all in all, I think we are in this race to have a vaccine. And when we develop a vaccine, what we are aiming for in the end, of course, is to show the vaccine works, it is safe, and it protects against the infection or against the disease. And then subsequently, for vaccine developers, the question is to produce with high quality and large quantity. That's a question actually for COVID-19 has to be tackled early on. We don't need to wait for the results. We need to look into that now. And there are initiatives in that sense already to look into having a large quantity of vaccines and so on and so forth. And lately, the vaccine has to be used. Vaccination helps prevent infection and disease. So we need to be very careful with public trust in vaccine to make it right, to develop it, to show it's safe. And of course, it works and protects against infection or disease. So the conclusion I wanted to say here actually is that international cooperation between governments is urgently needed. And we have started seeing this kind of cooperation already, to project actually the demand and plan the necessary capacity to produce sufficient quantity of a future vaccine that will turn out to be effective and safe. And we need more than one actually vaccine. International coordination is even more important in this case to complete the R&D or the clinical research stage, and again, ensuring in the end universal access of the vaccine. And there's a need for pool mechanism to incentivize the swift completion of the most promising R&D project, which means to complement the funds already engaged, allocated to provide incentives for completing your R&D project and making a vaccine available at the end of the day. And there's another critical point that is, I think, already being tackled by vaccine developers, is to look into the large-scale manufacturing capacity that has to be built now, while R&D or clinical trials or research is underway. And lastly, rules need to be set now to manage all the questions around intellectual property rights and procurement for equitable access. And in a nutshell, multiple stakeholders have to be engaged in the COVID-19 response. And my last word would be to say we cannot allow access to vaccines to increase inequalities within and between countries, whether there are low, middle, or high income countries. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. WARTEL. I propose you to continue with Dr. Spencer Shorte, Chief Scientific Officer at the Institut Pasteur, Korea. Thank you, Mr. Shorte, to be with us today.
Thank you indeed for organizing this, very interesting webinar event. We're very pleased to take part, and I'm very pleased to be here representing the Institut Pasteur, Korea. There's limited time, so I'd like to jump straight to it, to speak of our efforts in Institut Pasteur, Korea towards developing drug therapies to answer to the need of addressing the pandemic, to develop drugs effectively to suppress the virus and to improve clinical outcomes. And I'll try to give a context to the motivation behind that in the next few slides. Just a few words about the foundation of the Institut Pasteur Korea. We were founded back in 2004 as a part of the Pasteur International Network, which is, as you see in this, summary slide of the network, is some 32 member institutes distributed across 25 countries, with some 23,000 employees and scientists working throughout the world. The Institut Pasteur in Korea is an independent private organization working under the wings of the Ministry of Science and Technology. It was founded based on an agreement between the Institut Pasteur in Paris, the International Network, and the Korean government. And in that context, we have established an institute that was focused specifically on development of innovative technologies to accelerate drug development. And that's very much going to be the focus of my next few slides. In the context of COVID-19, we are at a stage that seems somewhat unprecedented. We have recourse to social distancing and contact tracing in the context of a pandemic to which there is no therapy, no vaccine, and no cure. The holy grail is a vaccine that will facilitate herd immunity. And as Dr. WARTEL just pointed out, quoting the WHO, it's not until everybody comes over the red line that we're all going to be safe. And so this is a very important consideration for the development of therapies, whether they be vaccine, whether they be chemotherapies. We see the vaccine as the holy grail towards facilitating herd immunity. There are incompressible elements in vaccine development that mean that we have no immediate solution now. So in some ways we wish to, on the side of developing drugs, we wish to rapidly find therapies that can be introduced to help manage the clinical challenge at the public health management level. And this is really the focus of the Institut Pasteur Korea. Founded in 2004, the vision of the Institut Pasteur Korea was to effectively accelerate drug discovery. And so in the context of building the bridge to gap between our situation now and the situation where we will eventually have optimistically herd immunity established based on the distribution and availability, equitable availability of a vaccine at a global scale, we could be looking at months to years. And I think all of us are very conscious of the need for this type of webinar to address what needs to be coordinated to really make that happen. The Institut Pasteur Korea, founded in 2004, we established technologies for accelerating drug discovery. That's effectively the objective of the Institute, was to find ways to bring rapidly new drugs into play that would address neglected diseases and diseases of high medical need, and to fill the gap where a big pharma may not necessarily see the value to develop drugs of interest. And so in many ways, the COVID crisis precipitated effectively a role for Institut Pasteur Korea for which it was designed. That was to rapidly pivot the resources in order to make available potential drug candidates that could come to deployment clinically very rapidly. The technologies I'm not going to go into, suffice to say that the key technology we use is high content screening, which effectively uses cell-based assays to have the cell tell us in the context of screening many hundreds of thousands of compounds, which compounds may be promising to address the pathology of a specific infectious disease. So by creating a target-free screening context, a sort of black box in which the cell can respond by showing whether infection can proceed or not in the presence of different chemicals, we're able to then screen the chemical space to try to identify new drugs. Now, of course, screening many hundreds of thousands of compounds in itself takes a great deal of time. And so even in the conventional drug development pipeline, which we see here in the colors of the roadmap here from gray to dark here, average development for drug development the average time for development is in the range of about 10 years and can cost tens to hundreds of millions of dollars. More recently, to try to accelerate the development of drugs that can be rapidly deployed, an interesting strategy has emerged that is called drug repositioning, whereby rather than screening the entire chemical space of many hundreds of thousands of compounds, in fact, we can narrow down to just a few hundreds to thousands of compounds, which are already approved for clinical use. So that means to turn to libraries of compounds that have already been approved by regulatory agencies or have come close to regulatory approval. So the advantage here is that we can compress a certain part of this pathway, such as the phase 1 clinical part and the preclinical parts can be compressed based on the fact that the compounds have already been approved for toxicity and tolerance in a clinical context. However, this seems a little antithetical because, of course, the FDA approved compound that works in one indication, one may ask the question, why should it work in another indication? It turns out empirically, in fact, this is not a poorly posed question. In fact, FDA approved compound libraries appear to have quite diverse effects that allow for them to be screened against other seemingly unrelated clinical indications. So in the case of COVID-19, in fact, IPK in the last few months has turned its FDA library and all of its screening platform to screening for compounds in the FDA approved library that may impact the COVID-19. In fact, what I'll summarize with is just a couple of slides that mention the top candidates that we believe offer the greatest promise. A number of laboratories around the world, the few that have the capacity to run these types of screens, have come up with similar results. And so we feel somehow reinforced that we're coming up as a community, scientifically, we're coming up with a coherent conclusions based on looking at these conversion FDA libraries. So among the 1,500 FDA-approved drugs that we screened, there were some 20 candidates that showed primarily effects that could be described as being suppressing the virus in the context of the black box screening, the high content screening. And 4 drug candidates offer themselves as we believe very promising candidates for actually some of the reasons that Dr. WARTEL mentioned earlier, and some of the reasons that Mr. DERUFFE mentioned earlier on, whereby the compounds themselves offer themselves as a solution in this context for equitable distribution and for manufacturing capacity and scalability. So the first is cyclosinide, which is, as you'll recognize, is actually asthma corticosteroid anti-asthma drug. It's an inhaler that you see people that have asthma, they have to use. It turns out that cyclosinide, in addition to its anti-inflammatory effects, which are known to help in asthma, in fact, it has apparently a direct effect, which is an antiviral effect on the SARS-CoV-2. This effect appears to be mediated by inhibition of the endoribonuclease, the NSP15, which is a protein that is a viral protein which is necessary to the propagation, replication of the virus. And a number of other groups have had exactly the same results come to them at more or less the same time. And this has led to efforts to put into clinical trials cyclosinide. It has a relatively low, it works in relatively effective low micromolar concentrations. So it's not highest level of efficacy, but it appears to have an effect that is clinically manageable. And so could have a lot of promise for less severe patients of COVID-19. The second compound shown on the right here is niclosamide, which is an anti-parasite compound, which has been around for literally decades and has been used as an antihelminthic drug to clear parasites from the gut, from ingestion. And it turns out that niclosamide actually has, again, antiviral effects where it comes to the SARS-CoV-2, because it, in fact, enhances the autophagy process, which is the same pathway that is hijacked by the virus in order to create a replicative niche intracellularly. So effectively, niclosamide inhibits the cellular niche that allows for the virus to reproduce itself. So it breaks the life cycle of the virus, and does this at median nanomolar concentrations. And so this is potentially a very useful drug in a clinical context. Again, generic, and the intellectual property makes it available to everybody. This is something that can be deployed to countries all around the world. The last two are related, nafamostat and camostat. Nafamostat and camostat both have the same target. They are actually indicated for as anticoagulants in pancreatitis and other related diseases in terms of clinical indication. They've been used for several, probably for about 15 years now. They've been used in clinical scenarios in Japan and other parts of Asia, including Korea. And their effect is to inhibit the protease, serine 2 protease that is used by the virus to activate entry into the epithelial cells of the lung, thereby blocking the ability of the virus to bind to the ACE2 receptor and blocking the entry of the virus into cells. So there's no ability to create the viral niche intracellularly. What's extremely interesting here is that the camostat and the nafamostat both seem to work at concentrations that are extremely relevant for clinical deployment. Camostat is actually an oral application, so oral administration in the form of a tablet, so it could be used for prophylactic, early, less severe cases of COVID-19. And the nafamostat is actually an IV application that could be used for severe cases and works at an incredibly high EC50, so it runs at, it has effects on the viral entry at concentrations as low as 3 nanomolar. So effectively, camonsertib and nafamostat both promise themselves as potential drugs for managing the clinical context of COVID-19. And again, the intellectual property, the patents are run out. These are generic drugs that can be manufactured in other parts of the world by other entities, multiple entities. So just to summarize with this last slide, effectively, we see a schema of the positioning of the drugs that we and other groups around the world have identified. We are coming to a consensus of what might be, if you like, an armory to fight COVID-19 and to manage the clinical context of COVID-19 in the period that we are waiting to establish a vaccine strategy. This armory begins to look quite effective potentially, and all of the drugs that are indicated on this schema could be to the hands of the clinician used to manage the whole context of the multiple types of very broad spectrum of clinical responses that we see. The drugs that we've identified are cheap, plentiful. They would be sustainable in terms of ease and scalability of manufacturing, and could be implemented in many different parts of the world. They would be low cost, and they would give equitable access, we think, that would fit with the necessity to have international availability driven by humanitarian need. With that, I think I apologize again for the false start. They use a lot of time. I'd like just to thank my colleagues that we work with here in the Institut Pasteur, Korea, and hand back to the chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Short. We are pleased now to welcome Dr. Kim Sung-Oog, CEO of Knowhere Bio.
Thank you for inviting me for this webinar. And I'm the CEO of this company called Knowhere Bio here in Korea. I'm going to talk about the two things. The one is about the test kits and the little bit of the technology and science. And we are collaborating with the company called Miko Biomed here in Korea also, which manufactured the COVID-19 test kits. And in my company here in Knowhere Bio, we actually developed the COVID-19 drugs. So that's going to be the second part. So, sorry. So overall, there are many different kinds of the tests available, including antigen test or antibody test or the real-time PCR test. So the serological test, we normally say it's the same as antibody test. And the antibody test takes about 10 to 15 minutes, and the highest accuracy. The scientific term for accuracy is sensitivity and specificity, and it's in average that we can just say that the accuracy of 93.6%. But the antigen test, it's an alternative to the real-time PCR test, and it takes about 30 minutes, and it has a little bit lower accuracy than the real-time PCR and the antibody test, because this antigen test has a kind of a technical flaw, I can say, because recently a lot of this antigen test has been the emergency user authorization by US FDA or the European the EMEA or something, that they cancel this authorization. So that leaves the two technology that we can use for testing the COVID-19. So one is a serological test, and the other one is real-time PCR. So the conventional real-time PCR, it has a very high accuracy, but the problem is it takes quite a long time. So it takes about 3 hours to complete the entire test. But realistically, in the real settings, that it can take up to 12 hours or overnight, because in the test center, they don't test the individual samples at the time, because they collect like a couple of thousand samples, and they run parallel in the test center. So from the collecting the samples to the end of the result, that it takes about 1 or 2 days. So we are actually collaborating with the Microbiomed in terms of the clinical trials with our drugs. In Europe, actually, we are preparing the clinical studies in Europe, and with the collaboration with this, the real-time PCR machine, but it's based on the technology called lab-on-a-chip technology. So overall, test period, it takes about 40 minutes and still maintains the same accuracy. So this is the device that we are, collectively promoting. And on the left-hand side, that you have the prep machine, and the right-hand side that you have actual RT-PCR machine. And inside that you actually add this lab on a chip. It's kind of a small lab on a chip. So it has the machinery inside that has a kind of intercalating the hot block from hot block to the cold block, and the machine is actually moving side by side, so that it actually shortens the RT-PCR time. So it's field tested in actually field tested in the Winter Olympics and Asian swimming games, and the 23 years old the World Cup, and this device is made in Korea. So if you look into a little bit more in detail, that it looks like this. So this is the only lab on a chip RT-PCR device in the world that you can have the test result in less than an hour. And you can run 14 samples at a time, and it already have a CE, and the US FDA, they have the EUA, the Emergency User Authorization. So let me talk about our drugs. So to begin with a little bit of background about our drug design principle, so that our technology is based on the chemistry called redox biochemistry. So we can explain this mechanism by lock and key analogy. So in normal enzyme, that you can have this, in terms of analogy, that you can see this enzyme as a lock, and the key is the substrate, or you can say like food, or the glucose, or the sugar, or you eat, and that is that the sugar is degraded by the enzyme or the proteins in your body or in your cell. So if our target, in this case the COVID-19, is the target, or the enzyme here, or the protein, that we normally design the key to be quite fitted into the lock system. but the pharmaceutical company or the laboratories in the university or the research lab, they don't consider the oxidative stress or the redox environment. So in vitro, what we call in the lab, that we can design the optimal drugs, or in this case it's a key. But in real situation, that key and lock doesn't work, because the lock, for example, has the rust, which means oxidated sites, so that the key cannot quite fit into this enzyme or the lock in this case. So on the right hand side, that you can see that if we have a protein, that the protein has many different kinds of amino acid, and one of the amino acids called the cysteine, and cysteine has the thiol groups, and these thiol groups can be oxidized from SH to SOH, which is a sulfonic acid, and SO2H, which is further oxidized by the oxidation, and is what we call the sulfonic acid, and SO3H, which is the most oxidized form, and it's a irreversible oxidized form, and what we call the sulfonic acid. And that's the hallmark of the cell death, or the apoptosis, or the cancer. What I mean by that is when you have a cancer, and if you look into the proteins, and the most of the proteins are oxidized, and you can detect those, the cysteines get oxidized in the form of sulfonic acid or sulfonic acid, like in the far right here, in the very dark red. So that's the principle of our the drug design concept. So based on the redox biochemistry, that we designed the target for bad protein. Here in this case, we designed compounds like 300 different compounds, and we using these compounds to try to find the cure for cancer and diabetes and inflammation, and in this case, the COVID-19. So let's skip this, the principle, and we did preclinical trials, and let me explain this, the slide further. So the principally on the left-hand corner, that you have a pink protein, which their normal function is to recognize the acetylated site of the histone molecule. And we designed the little over 300 compounds to inhibit those BRD4 proteins, which is depicted as a pink protein in the left-hand corner. And the virus protein from the COVID-19 or the HIV or all kinds of RNA viruses, that is depicted as the green ring here in the picture. And it produced the E2 protein. And E2 protein is actually, I mean, this is the mechanism of how the E2 protein is interact with the BRD4, which is the drug target. So the E2 protein is disguising as the human protein after the acetylation. So by attacking the interaction between the E2 protein with the BRD4, that we can achieve the inhibition of the viral infection. So that's the one mechanism. And the second mechanism is that all this BRD4, BRD2 inhibitor has the function of the preventing the cytokine storm, or the suppressing the immunological response. So the conjunction of the cytokine storm preventing function and directly interact with the virus protein, so that our drug, in this case, KWB-0406, has a dual function. So in many pharmaceutical companies, they are developing some drugs that are targeting for cytokine storm prevention, which Dr. Spencer also mentioned that the niclosamide, that is one of the drugs that are trying to be preventing this cytokine storm. But our drug actually has a dual function. So this is the data. So on the right-hand corner, there's a company called Resvologics, which is registered in the Canadian stock market, and they produced a drug called RBX208, and in the drug name is apabetalon, and this is not to be developed as the COVID-19 drug, but they are still in the clinical phase 3, and for the atherosclerosis drug, and since our drug and the RBX208 from the Resvologics has a common target, which is in this case BRD2 or BRD4, and we share the same mechanism. So on the right-hand corner, that you have a paper by bioRxiv, and there is a recent paper published by this company that they testing this RBX208, try to target the COVID-19 infection. And we actually compare this, our drugs compared to RBX208 head-to-head. And although we used 1 micromole final concentration, but the RBX208 has a 18% virus inhibition effect, and we have almost double the effect. And I'd like to remind you that the concentration that we use here is actually much less than the hydroxychloroquine or the remdesivir in normal conditions, so that I can say that these drugs, which we are developing, and we're ready to go for the human trial in few weeks' time in Europe, that we hope for the very high potential for as a drug candidate. As you can see on the left-hand corner, that this green fluorescent signals is actually disappearing in the 1 micromole of the KWB-0406 as compared to the DMSO, or the DMSO as the negative control. So I'd like to summarize my presentation by thanking for organization for the presence of the FKCCI, and if you have any the questions regarding the test kits, of course, the Korea has many the test kit developers, the manufacturers, and I have all the contacts with them, and so that if you have any needs for supply issue and all that, and you can ask me for that the question. And as well as I'm developing this kind of drugs, so that if anybody also have any interest or questions, and you can always contact me. And thank you very much for the time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Kim. Then we'll continue now with Mr. Samuel WARTEL, Medical Director of the Asia Response Center at International SOS.
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar. So COVID-19 is first and foremost a global humanitarian challenge. Health professionals, government, industry are working to understand and address the challenge, and to support the victims, the communities, and search for treatment and vaccine. Companies around the world need to act promptly as well. So the purpose of this presentation is first to help you to have a better understanding of the COVID-19 situation, medically, and I will give you some economic information as well, and to keep steps by providing recommendations and guidelines which will help you and your staff to adapt to the new normality that we are facing now. COVID-19 cases have exceeded 13 million and are continuing to increase worldwide. Today, the COVID-19 pandemic is particularly serious in the USA, in Brazil, and in India. But the world is moving into uncharted waters. A few months ago, no one would expect such a situation. And the resurgence of the virus is highly dependent on the characteristic of the virus, considering the fatality rates, duration of the immunity, and the country's response to the virus. On the economic point of view, many experts believe that recovery will be bumpy and slow. And of course, some economic sectors will suffer more than others. According to this scenario A3, considering that the virus is under control shortly, we can expect favorable outcome early 2021. On the other hand, if we experience virus recurrence, the return to the pre-crisis level will take much more time with significant impact all over the world. Please note that for both scenarios described before, A1 and A3, China is recovering faster than the rest of the world. I don't know if it's true, it's only prediction. But we know as well that China's economic recovery depends on the rest of the world. According to this analysis as well, the economic impact is negative for a 10-year perspective and represent an average 45% of performance. The negative trend concerns all industry, even though some industries such as pharma seems to be slightly less affected than other industries like petroleum, commercial aerospace industry, and automobile industry. In addition, according to the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, a low impact of COVID-19 in terms of case number and deaths does not necessarily translate into a low economic impact. In other words, is country with a similar numbers of COVID-19 related death may experience very different levels of economic loss, depending on the severity of the containment measure implemented and their indirect effects. In summary, an effective strategy that tests, tracks people, and trace their contacts is probably the best option. This is the strategy adopted by South Korea from the very beginning, and many countries are considering and anticipating this strategy in case of peak, cluster, and second wave. As mentioned before, many governments are mobilized to address the challenge, but for the industry, what do we recommend? Each organization should determine which staff is essential and non-essential at the office. Non-essential staff at the office should work from home, but on a rotational basis. They need to come back sometimes to work, to the office, to see the colleagues. You need to review employees' needs and circumstances to work from home and to work from the office. You need to set up business continuity planning team, the BCP team, crisis management team, CM team, and you need to decide on frequency of BCP and CM team meeting. You need to decide on the sources of information collection, secure means of communication, be aware of security triggers for potential risk, but be practical, and be flexible. Of course, everyone must continue to practice good hygiene at all times to prevent the virus spreading. We all know that. I will not insist. Let me just tell you, social distancing as well is a key tool, but keep in mind that social distancing is physical distancing. It's not social separation. The COVID-19 pandemic may be stressful for people. Fear and anxiety about a new disease and what could happen can cause strong emotion in adults and children. Public health actions such as social distancing can make people feel isolated, lonely, and can increase stress, anxiety. However, We know that these actions are necessary to reduce the spread of the COVID-19. We receive more and more calls, more and more requests from people, our members, asking for mental health support. And we develop, therefore, new tools like the Life Resilience Workshop and the Mental Health Action Plan. How you respond to the stress during the COVID-19 pandemic depends on your background, your social support, your family and friends, your financial situation, your health and emotional background, the community you live in, and many other factors. The changes can happen because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the way we try to contain the spread of the COVID-19 virus can affect everyone. Everyone reacts differently from stressful situation, but as a manager, it's important for you to understand that you may face more sensitive situation. You need to identify your staff when they experience anxiety, and you need to provide appropriate response like encouraging your colleague to access health and well-being opportunities, for example. Few preventive measures can be recommended for the well-being of your staff in the crisis situation that we are facing now. Communication, of course, providing information, education. You need to repeat the information. Trust, which is a common sense. Each individual must ask more responsibly to protect himself and others. Patience. Take time to explain business continuity plan to your colleagues. Take time to explain long-term perspective. And last but not least, resilience, which is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulty. And remember, mental health is just as important as physical health. It's important for a company to develop a strategy, perform assessments, perform staff survey, train your manager, train your employees, and in some situations, consider mental health supports. Telehealth consultation is expanding now. In time of stress and anxiety, your workforce may need professional emotional support, often on short notice, and the best will be in their native language. Having access to the mental health professional counselor over the phone can make a difference and can help your people to make the right decision at the critical time. You can see in my slides 3 examples of response plan that we develop. Work remotely and manage virtual team. 12 ways to stay productive while working from home. Coping in stressful situation. I do not have time to develop further, but as we all know, successful businesses have happy and healthy employees. Let me finish now with some information regarding the travel. The COVID-19 pandemic is expected to continue for many more months, and traveling abroad is now a real challenge. Before traveling, please explore government restrictions on both country, origin and destination, and travel requirements and policy. We know, for example, for that few countries suspended the e-visa and visa on arrival program. Laos, where I am now, has a national COVID-19 committee who is supposed to review and approve all requests of visa and provide the appropriate document to obtain a visa. COVID-19 negative medical certificate needs to be issued no more than 72 hours prior to the date of their travel. Proof of medical insurance coverage. In Cambodia, you need to prove that you have at least 50,000 insurance coverage before that you can enter the country. In Cambodia as well, they will ask you to make a deposit of $3,000 upon arrival at the international airport for mandatory COVID-19 testing and potential treatment service. And we know all compulsory 14 days quarantine at the location designated by the local authorities, or self-quarantine at home if you are lucky, under supervision of the local authorities. Last word about South Korea. Entry and their exit requirements are very clear for the foreigners. We need a re-entry permit prior to departing for international travel. The permits are available at immigration office, airport, and port offices. The re-entry permit is valid for 1 year, and failure to apply for the re-entry permit prior to departure will result of the cancellation of your alien card. When you come back to South Korea, you need to provide a medical certificate or a COVID-19 test before boarding the flight to Korea. And we have this experience as well from France or ourselves. All passengers entering Korea will undergo a special quarantine. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wartel. For the conclusion, we have the pleasure to have Sebastien FALLETTI, journalist at Le Figaro.
I'm very honored to conclude this seminar, this very interesting seminar. As I just said in French, I'm not an expert in health issues, so I will wrap up this and I will not dwell into the details, but I want to just give a few key ideas that I heard today that were really interesting. The first thing is, as we all know, this crisis is unique. This sanitary crisis is unique in terms of the speed and the scale of the challenges. But as it had been said just before, we are facing a race against time, but we're also facing unprecedented mobilization from all the actors, private sector, public sectors, governments. There is a race against time, and there's also a competition. So this is extremely, it's unprecedented in scale. Of course, just a few months back, this was not even imaginable. And that brings some positive side to it, because as we can see, never ever probably we've been seeing so many people trying to get a vaccine and so much money, so much funds invested. So that offered a chance that we might get a breakthrough much faster than it was in the past. So that's the positive side to it. But there's another side to it, which is also, it's a competition. This epidemic is also happening and creating a context of very strong geopolitical rivalry between, of course, China, the US, but also other countries. This is becoming more than an health issue. This is becoming a major political competition for diverse countries, diverse regime. And of course, the race for the vaccine is also taking place into that context. So we know that, for example, China, where the virus, the epidemic first developed, is now putting a lot of effort on their side to find a virus, find a vaccine, and they're putting massive effort subsidized by the states. And this is a major political endeavor for the government in China. Of course, for other countries, also we're seeing a major political dimension to here, both in Western countries, in the US, here in Korea, everywhere for government. This is a key point. So it makes this race much more sensitive than it was in the past. So I think one of the key points here is we're going to have to watch in the coming months and probably until next year is how this is going to unfold, because there is, of course, a big mobilization which make it faster, but there's also this context could also create new hurdle, new competition. There's a risk that some states try to limit the implication. They want to keep some of the vaccine for their own population. There's also a major social issue here. As it's been mentioned, if there is a vaccine, is this vaccine going to be available to whom? Which population first? Is it your own population, if you're a decision maker, a leader in a country? Or is it going to be open to other countries, and at which speed? And is it going to be open to underdeveloped economies, population in need? And at what speed? These questions are crucial because they can lead also to major political, social question that will backfire also for all the stakeholders, both public and private. So basically, this is the bottom line I would say is that this issue is far more than about health. It's a major a complex, both political and socio-economic issue. And that's why for stakeholders, everyone, it's more challenging than ever, because you cannot just look about your own focus point, your expertise. You have to take into account far more factors. So I think in the coming months, that will be some of the key points to watch. And as has been mentioned by several speakers here, one of the points is, of course, research on the vaccine, but also if we find a vaccine, then production capacity, manufacturing, where we can do this. And you could have some companies find a vaccine, but some other countries would have more capacity for a vaccine. For example, in China, they're already talking about 2 or 3 companies that are working on vaccine, and they're saying they can produce as soon as next year 100 million vaccine. The capacity, the logistics that we've already seen in the past few months when it was about dealing with the urgency of the crisis, like for the mask. These question of logistics, this question of a very concrete logistic question is going to be back in the coming months when it comes to the vaccine. So, of course, that means for each country, they're gonna have to play with all these different issues. And for countries like South Korea, for example, which is like a middle sized country, there are some opportunities to play, because you can play with many different actors. You have also, as we've seen, a lot of expertise, research, but there's also, of course, some challenges, because you're facing also some competitors who have a huge political clout behind and who have huge political imperative. So maybe I will stop here, but with this idea that, of course, what we have seen in the last 6 months was extremely challenging for everyone in terms of facing the urgency, but probably the next coming months and the next years will bring other challenges which are quite similar, which are the crux of politics, economics, and socio-economic challenges. And I will stop here with maybe one final question that I can open to the floor of, is I want to ask all the distinguished experts here is, we have been talking about a race about a vaccine, but do you think, is it possible that we actually don't find a vaccine in the coming 18 months, as we said, that the world has to learn to live with that option of not having a vaccine, but is there some alternative to at least bring back the world into a more smooth order? Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Sebastien. Who wants to answer first?
Well, I mean, I can go first, right, since it is related to vaccines. I think, as I mentioned earlier on, we are quite somehow fortunate under these circumstances to have a lot of developers, for vaccines being into the race. As I said, there are more than 200 vaccine candidates as of today, and there will be more in the coming month or so. So to me, the probability to not have one, it's somehow unlikely, right? It's a question of probability. But on the other hand, when we talk about the failure rate is quite high. So it's good to have multiple companies looking to that, whether these are big pharma guys or these are biotech companies. So it's good to have all people engaged and to look into that. And there was also some, question of funding in the past. What has happened is that you have an outbreak. There's a high attention on the outbreak. I'm thinking of MERS, I'm thinking of SARS, right? In the end, when the virus disappeared, the attention was going down. So no funding anymore, no developers looking into that anymore. Here, nowadays, we are quite fortunate because there are more organizations helping out with this issue. In addition to the private sectors, you have public sectors looking into that, engaging with countries, governments, and also raising funding, raising money to help some big companies to some extent, and also smaller companies to develop a vaccine. So all in all, when you put all these things together, I think we need to remain hopeful to have a solution for COVID-19 pandemic. And lastly, I would say, it's not only a vaccine that can help or vaccination, in addition to drugs for acute situation. It's a combination of different things. And to me, thinking of the hygiene measures is not bad, actually it's good. These are the principles we have forgotten over time, right? To wash our hands on a regular basis. So it's a question of using the basic things that we might have forgotten over time. And having this mask wearing, of course, is much more question of habits, and it's difficult to change the habit in some countries or so. But wearing the mask can also help somehow reduce the transmission of the virus. And then keeping social distancing as much as we can, depending on the circumstances. But that is something that could be perceived as a burden over time. But if we keep to the two first one I just mentioned in terms of measures, that can help also. So in a nutshell, we shouldn't give up to think of having a vaccine. We shouldn't give up with the simple measures, hygiene measures. We can carry on, even though after that we don't have COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 circulating anymore, but washing hands remains a good tool to keep for our personal individual life, right? So these are my preliminary thoughts on your questions. I think we should remain hopeful to have a tool, to have a solution, and also remain resilient. And thinking of mental health, we need to be mindful and careful about that as well.
Thank you very much. Someone wants to add something? No? As it's a little late, maybe we can close this session now.
Yeah, yes. So I would like to thank everybody, all the participants, and especially all our speakers, not only for your speech, but for your work and for your effort, your thought that you have so well explained. You have explained the difficulties, and so it's you are very important because we are leaning on you and we are counting on you. So I'm very glad that we finish this semester with you, because it reminds everybody how much this fight is crucial for us, and how much you are mobilized to find a cure, to find a solution. And I think it's very nice to finish with you and to thank you sincerely for all your effort.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you indeed.